Before we begin tonight, I'd like to say welcome. My name is John Tillell. I'm the student co-chair of the Iowa State Lectures Committee. It's great to see so many smiling faces on such a cold night. And I'd like to make a couple announcements of upcoming lectures we have coming to Iowa State. Tomorrow night, here in the Sunroom at 8 p.m., we have a lecture entitled Why Intelligent Design is Not Science. And the speaker is Robert M. Hazen, who is the Clarence Robinson Professor of Earth Science at George Mason University and a scientist at the Carnegie Institution of Washington's Geophysical Laboratory. So that's very interesting. And then on Saturday at 5 p.m. here in the Sunroom, Rebecca Nyan Deng, widow of John Garang, will provide an update on the implementation of the peace agreement in Sudan and the conflict in the Darfur region. It'll be another extremely important lecture. It'll be awesome for everybody to attend. And finally, next Wednesday at 8 p.m. here in the Sunroom as well, we have a speech entitled Defining Values in American Politics, and it'll be given by Thomas Frank, who is the author of What's the Matter with Kansas? How Conservatives Won the Heart of America and One Market Under God. So, please come. We hope to see you guys here. And John Day is going to introduce our distinguished guest. So, John, thanks.
Good evening. On behalf of Iowa State University, it is my privilege tonight to welcome to our stage Good evening. On behalf of Iowa State University, it is my privilege tonight. Okay. On behalf of Iowa State University, it is my privilege tonight to welcome to our stage a man who has dedicated his career to public service. Most notably, he has served 3 terms in the United States Senate. 9 of his 18 years he spent as the Senate Majority Leader and, more recently, the Senate Minority Leader. Tonight he will be speaking to us about setting America on a new course. And afterwards he'll be answering some questions from the audience. Please welcome to the stage Senator Tom Daschle.
Thank you very much, John, for that generous introduction. Thank you all for your warm reception. I want to thank Pat Miller as well, who does such an outstanding job in arranging these lectures. I think she deserves a big round of applause as well. John was fretting a little bit about the introduction. I think he did a terrific job, and I thank both of them. 6 months ago, if somebody would have said I'd be in Iowa and somebody would be referring to John and John, I was like to think it would have been the President and the Vice President of the United States, but that isn't going to happen, at least for now. But you're always cognizant of introductions as you travel from one venue to the next. I'll never forget that time I was introduced as a model politician and a model South Dakotan and a model United States Senator. Felt very good about that introduction until my wife Linda showed me the word model as it's defined in the dictionary, and there it's defined as a small replica of the real thing. So John chose not to use that word, and I appreciate it very much. But I also have what I now consider to be a surefire way for Democrats to do a better job in the next election. I made a point of not stepping on the Zodiac on my way in, and I'm feeling a lot more invulnerable already, and I appreciate the chance to be here. This is an extraordinary lecture series. We were talking before the program started tonight about the access you have to people from around the country, and what a remarkable opportunity it is. I feel very privileged to be among the speakers and to be in front of the person to speak about intelligent design tomorrow night. I think that would be a little tougher act to follow. But I also want to thank Iowa overall for the tremendous role that you play in national politics. I remember so well that scene from the Field of Dreams where shoeless Joe Jackson steps out and asks, "Is this heaven?" And the character played by Kevin Costner replies, "No, it's Iowa." That reminds me of the extraordinary role that you play not only every 4 years, but virtually every year. I don't know how else you explain that the governor of New York made as one of his major platform issues this year the acquisition of and the development of ethanol as a real opportunity for New York. I think this is great. Where else could you have that kind of reach? But clearly it shows that our nation entrusts Iowa with a very important role in choosing our nation's course. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that tonight. In a very real sense, it does fall to you to decide whether or not you accept the status quo or whether you think that the time has come to change America's outlook. Since leaving the Senate, I've given a great deal of thought to that question. Can we accept the status quo? And nothing crystallized my thinking more about that question than a trip I took last fall with Senator Bob Dole to Europe. Some of you may understandably wonder how it was that Bob Dole and Tom Daschle went to Europe on some sort of a buddy-buddy roadshow. Well, there's an answer to that. Partisanship aside, Bob Dole is somebody with whom I had the good fortune to work when I became the Democratic leader in 1994. I served with 3 Republican leaders, and he was the first. We developed a very close relationship and a friendship that transcended our many differences on positions on the issues. And so when I left the Senate, he was actually one of the first people to call me to talk about my post-Senate plans. Well, I have to admit, at first I was a little concerned about getting the call. After all, some of you may recall what Bob's first job was in leaving the Senate. And not having been a customer myself, but it turns out he made an entirely different offer. And that offer was to join him at a law firm by the name of Alston and Bird. And I am delighted to work with him every day now in that firm. And as a part of our work with the law firm Alston and Bird, we took a business trip to Europe together last October. We traveled through Paris, Berlin, London, and I have to say it was truly moving to watch this hero of World War II return to a continent that he helped liberate 60 years ago. Remarkable. Before we left, I was reminded again of a story a colleague told me about that time when Bob Dole was there first. It's a story about a constituent of my colleague's who was born in Czechoslovakia, but who fled to Austria and then ultimately to America as a very young man. After the end of communist domination in Czechoslovakia, this young man decided, since he wasn't so young any longer, he'd go back and try to pay back his country for all the good that he had acquired growing up in that small town that he called home. He went back, and as the curtain of fear was lifted and the Russian tanks pulled away, he was amazed at what he saw almost from the very beginning after getting off the train. He saw Czechoslovakians, first and foremost, rebuilding a monument to the American GIs who liberated them. And then I saw something that was most unusual. Almost overnight, there were American flags, very little American flags that appeared everywhere. And he wondered how in the world could the people in my hometown have acquired all those little American flags so quickly? But then he looked more closely, and he found that those little flags didn't have 50 stars. They had 48. And they had actually saved them, hid them under their beds and in their cupboards, waiting for the day that they could proclaim their liberty and, more importantly, thank their liberators. A moving story and an example of what America represents when we are at our best. But on my journey to Europe with Senator Dole, all too often, my experience was different. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't a warm embrace either. People were wary, skeptical. They wanted to know why America was behaving the way it was. And there was one thing that virtually everyone asked about in October of last year. What happened with Hurricane Katrina? The people I met told me they were absolutely dumbfounded. They were struck by images of an America that most of them had no idea even existed. America impoverished, divided, left behind. And they were equally shocked to see a government that seemed so callous, so incredibly incompetent. Their shock was so poignant and yet so genuine. And you know, I wanted myself to be able to share it. But those of us who live in America know that you shouldn't be shocked. If you've ever visited an Indian reservation in South Dakota, you too know the horrific face of poverty. One of the things that makes America so great is that we have a document that lays out the expectations for each generation. An expectation that we strive to form a more perfect union. And with that more perfect union, we have a responsibility from one generation to the next to ensure that this union gets better. And so our job is never complete. And what upset me most was to realize that what was shocking to the rest of the world, unfortunately, has been accepted in so many ways by this administration as the status quo. And quite frankly, by too many Americans throughout our country. So what would you describe tonight as the status quo? Well, on one hand, our economy is the largest and the most dynamic in the world, and we heard last night the president talk about how it continues to grow. But on the other hand, our economic growth has become extraordinarily lopsided. Between World War II and 1979, the incomes of the top 1/5 of people in our country and the bottom 1/5 of people in our country actually doubled. But since 1979, while the wealthiest people in this country continue to get wealthier and wealthier, the income, the economic status of the lowest fifth of people in this country hasn't even budged. On one hand, we pay at least 50% more per capita for the health care that we now consume in this country over anyone else in the world. 50% more than the next closest country, Switzerland. But on the other hand, Do you know that just 2 years ago we ranked 37th in quality, 37th in performance, 37th in outcomes? And I would ask everyone tonight, what would we say if the United States came in 37th in the Olympics? On one hand, we have the best research universities in the world, and there's incredible work going on right here at Iowa State. And you can be very proud of the renewable fuels energy agenda that is so prominent here, the abilities that we're now developing on weather forecasting, and the extraordinary research for human-computer interaction. It's all happening right here. But on the other hand, our national educational performance is increasingly mediocre by international standards, and it's badly skewed by income. I grew up in Aberdeen, South Dakota, the very first person in my family to graduate from college. My father was a bookkeeper who worked on minimum wage at a small auto parts store in my hometown. We weren't rich, clearly, by any standard. Perhaps not even middle class. And South Dakota State University and the experience I had there changed my life. But if you look at studies today of virtually any elite university in the country, in a classroom of 20 people, only one comes from a family whose income is below $35,000. Only one. On the one hand, America wields more economic influence in foreign markets than any other country. We know that. But on the other hand, our federal deficit has swung from a projected surplus of $5 trillion to now a projected debt of over $8 trillion. And most of it is controlled. Most of it is now controlled by foreign governments, foreign investors. 44% of the debt now owned by others is held by countries like China and Japan. China is paying Americans to buy its products. That's a travesty. And as a result, we have the largest single trade deficit in our country's history. And the status quo we face looking out from our borders is just as uncertain. On the one hand, globalization has created a world in which if a tsunami hits Sri Lanka, our ships can be there in a matter of days. But on the other hand, a sneeze in Hong Kong can mean a quarantine in Toronto. On one hand, America remains the global center for innovation. But on the other hand, we've now become a net importer of technology, beginning 3 years ago. Here's a report and a statistic that troubled me. Intel, the famous American company, has a competition every year they call the Science and Engineering Competition. Last year, 65,000 Americans participated. American students, 65,000. Do you know what it was in China? 6 million. Americans, we're told today, by study after study, with ages between 45 and 54, are literally now considered better educated than Americans between the ages of 25 and 34. On one hand, we still lead the world in industrial production. But on the other hand, our industries rely on oil imported from nations increasingly who distrust us. On one hand, we have the best planes, the strongest tanks, the most powerful weapons, the best trained soldiers. But on the other hand, we are at war with enemies who see neither superpowers civilians, or for that matter, even borders. At this point, you're probably starting to think, well, Harry Truman may have been right. Harry Truman once said to all of his economic advisors who used to say on one hand but then on the other, he said, "Give me a one-handed economist." But these gaps between our problems and our policies, between our place and our potential, are widening. And they're a measure of our diminished opportunity, but also our weakened security. But today, my one challenge to you is not to see this trend as acceptable and, even more importantly, as irreversible. Our nation's finest moments have come when we've turned great challenges, the greatest challenges our country has faced, into great ideas and looked forward towards an America of purer purpose, of higher decency, and of greater justice. Franklin Roosevelt looked out over a nation that was ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-housed, and he challenged all of them to a rendezvous with destiny. And he set America on a new course. John Kennedy looked out upon a nation divided by injustice, at home and uncertain of its leadership all around the world. And he challenged America to a new frontier. And he changed America's course. And Bill Clinton, in the early 90s, saw a nation mired in a recession, unsure about its place in the world. And President Clinton said, "There's nothing wrong with America that can't be changed by what is right with America." And he too set our nation on a new course. These leaders didn't do these things through the force only of their personalities. They did it by tapping into the resource, to the hearts and minds of the American people, lifting us up and bringing us together, and ultimately recognizing that America's problems can be solved and in the hands of the American people. And the good news today, and the reason I can stand before you tonight and speak with optimism, as I look to all of these problems that I've just laid out, is because I believe Alexis de Tocqueville was absolutely right when he said, how long ago, that America is great because its people are good. We still are the hardest working people in the world, the greatest innovators, the strongest soldiers. Most Americans are still a generous and decent people. So the question is, how do we tap into that decency, that goodness? How do we take these challenges on by uniting rather than dividing, as we've seen so much of in the last 5 years? Does it mean that we have to stifle debate, muzzle the opponents? Absolutely not. I think speaking out on the great issues of the day is a requirement of a patriotic American. And we ought to be proud of the fact that we are prepared to differ and debate the issues of the day. And we ought to do it more, not less. I like to call political debate the noise of democracy. Sometimes it's not very stereophonic. Sometimes it's pretty screechy in the middle. But it's the only way I know for 300 million people to harmonize together. And the noise of democracy sure beats the noise of violence. So what I'm saying is that our debate needs to be underpinned by an understanding that we're all in this together. And that we have to rely upon each other if we're going to solve these problems as we have done so often in the past. That's the idea that's especially ingrained, I think, in our part of the country. I don't know how many in this room can point to grandparents or great-grandparents who homesteaded here. But that's how I came to the Midwest. My grandfather had the same name. He came from the Ukraine, and as a teenager, he had absolutely nothing to his name. But he responded to the call of this government and all of its people that there was land to be settled. And with work, we could make that land productive. And that's what happened. My own grandparents emigrated to this free land. And they were some of the most self-reliant people in the world. Independent and strong. Proud of their heritage. But they also understood something. No matter how independent, no matter how strong, there were some essential things that they couldn't do by themselves. Raising the barns, planting the crops, clearing the land. They understand that it took communities to build the schools and the roads and hire the teachers. And it took everyone in small towns working together to face the fierce storms of the Dakotas and clean up after the tornadoes and floods. They understood that whatever their differences, they were united in their desire to build community. To earn a living from the harsh plains took a realization that we are all in this together. And you know what? All these years later, that understanding hasn't changed one iota. They understood that those things that they couldn't do for themselves required community, required an efficient government at all levels, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I don't believe that even that kind of government in any form is the complete answer to our people's problems. But I must say, I strongly differ with those, especially in this administration, who believe that it is incapable of handling the challenges that we face as a nation or as our communities today. When I talk to families about health care, about education, about the national debt, you know what they tell me? They tell me that they're willing to do anything they have to sacrifice so their kids and grandkids don't have to. That's what I hear families tell me. When I speak to students about the great skills and challenges it's going to take to compete in a global climate, they say, I'm ready, bring them on because we want to compete. But give us the tools. There can be no doubt that our soldiers are willing to defend our safety, our freedom, against any threat on any continent in the world. The American people are ready to undertake the great challenges of our country. If government will help empower them to do so, because we all understand that, yes, just like my grandparents, we're all in this together. But you can't assert that you believe in government and that government has the ability to solve the problems we face when you appoint the commissioner of a horse association to be the head of national disaster relief effort. You can't do it. Or when you appoint a UN ambassador who said if the UN building lost 10 stories, it wouldn't make any difference. When you hire a national science advisor who makes no objection to teaching intelligent design in science classrooms. When these are the people you appoint, the idea of government incompetence becomes Well, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And when you allow corrupt legislators to turn what should be the people's house into an auction house, all Americans pay the price. A most egregious example of our nation's energy policy, in my view, is what we are now seeing today. When you boil it down, our dependence upon foreign oil dictates an energy policy where we borrow from our economic competitors to indirectly subsidize our military adversaries. That's what's happening tonight. Why is this our policy? Well, if you go to Washington, you'll see that the energy lobby is just across the street from the White House. And when policy gets made by oil company lobbyists, you end up with what we have. You end up with an energy program that gives tax breaks to the most profitable companies in the history of the world, but doesn't do nearly enough to reduce our dependence upon foreign oil. We need a different approach. We need a plan that makes our energy investments in the Midwest, not the Middle East. Tom Harkin and I spent the better part of the last 25 years to promote and build an ethanol and biodiesel industry that today, because of what has been done so far, reduces our dependency upon foreign sources by 3 billion gallons a year, creating thousands of good-paying jobs. We should go even further. Last year, when I did my annual drive around South Dakota, which I did every year, for a while I drove an E85 car, a car that runs on 85% ethanol. And what really troubled me is that there were no 85 ethanol pumps in the state of South Dakota, so I couldn't go very far. Just last month I was in California. There are only 4 E85 pumps in the entire state of California, and 3 of them are not commercial. They're run by the government for government vehicles. It makes no sense when you buy a car that takes 85% ethanol, but you can't buy the fuel. We need to push oil companies, demand that oil companies make 85% ethanol available everywhere in this country where those cars are sold today. Wherever our national security is threatened, our country has moved mountains to develop the technological edge that kept us safe. When more than half of the oil comes from abroad, energy independence becomes a national security issue. And because our security is at stake, we need to focus our extraordinary resources and energy to invest in innovation that will free us from the gripping hold that foreign oil producers have on us today. There was one thing said last night that I did agree with wholeheartedly, and that was that America is addicted to oil and it's got to stop. We can create a hybrid economy in this country. A hybrid economy in this country where American homes and businesses are literally powered by American sources of energy. How wonderful it would be for our homes to be powered with gasified coal from Montana, or wind turbines from Nebraska, or solar energy from Arizona. How remarkable it would be for our cars and our trucks of all kinds, our buses, to be powered by ethanol and biodiesel and all the biofuels we're already capable of producing. We can create energy independence in this nation if we have the leadership to make it happen. And for those who wonder, where do we get our manufacturing jobs in the future? The answer is through a domestic energy infrastructure that requires American workers. Energy made by America for Americans, and those jobs will never be outsourced. So while the energy policy we have today is an example of one governmental philosophy, the energy policy we can have is another. And that other view, the view that I'm trying to articulate tonight, is that government has a role not as a leveler, not as a promoter of any particular creed or philosophy, but as a system of community, a system of opportunity that makes society stronger by allowing every individual to achieve his or her full potential. That's the view that recognizes one health statistic that I'm particularly proud of. When it comes to those over the age of 65, we lead the world in life expectancy because we have a Medicare system that guarantees every senior over the age of 65 will have health care tonight. That recognizes a system that recognizes the most critical discoveries in treating AIDS were made not by some pharmaceutical companies, but by the National Institute of Health. That recognizes a century ago businesses said child labor and clean food and drug reforms would hurt the market. But now that standard of decency is taken for granted, and we actually demand that every other country live up to that standard too. And so, facing a flattening world and a divided nation, we as Americans have to choose between two philosophies. One says that the American people, supported by government, can make a better world for all of us and for future generations. And another that says the American government, with or without the support of the American people, can only do so much. The government won't make this choice. The choice will be made by everyone in this room, especially here in Iowa. The choice is yours because each one of the people in this room has the power of one vote. In the last presidential election, 20.9 million people, almost 21 million people between the ages of 18 and 29 voted. And that's progress. Because in 2000, only 4.5 million fewer people in that age category, 18 to 29, actually voted. But we have a long way to go. Let me give you one point of comparison. In the season finale last year of American Idol, 65 million votes were cast. Now, I know that's not entirely fair because a lot of those who voted may have been under 18, and it wouldn't surprise me if some voted more than once. And I'm sure all of you were too busy to even watch the show, so you probably wouldn't know. But millions of those votes arrived by cell phone and by text messaging, which meant that millions of young people actually paid to vote for their choice for American Idol. Well, half of all eligible young voters still didn't show up to participate in the free exercise of voting for the American presidency. It concerns me when young people feel more empowered to impact something that happens on television than they do something that happens in Washington or your own community. I must say that's why I'm so excited and heartened that for the first time, as I understand it, in the history of the city of Ames, we now have an Iowa State student elected to city council. I think that's terrific. So your involvement begins with voting, but it certainly doesn't end there. I understand that what goes on 1,000 miles away in Washington can seem like a world away from your lives. But think about the decisions that are being made right tonight. We're facing big questions that will determine in large measure for the rest of our lives this: what kind of country do we want to be? Will we use our unsurpassed military power as a force just for vengeance and protection against those who destroy us? Or will we use it to spread progress and hope? Will we recognize that our belief in the rule of law is what makes us the envy of the world? Or will we sacrifice all of that for a surveillance program that can and should be conducted under existing law? Will we strive to uphold the American tradition of leaving to future generations a country that is stronger, fairer, and more prosperous? Or will we forfeit the promise of the future for things like ill-advised tax cuts and other rewards of the moment? These questions may sound abstract, but consider this. The budget that's currently being debated in the Congress attempts to close our deficit not by asking the wealthiest Americans to sacrifice, to give back something, or by allowing the government to negotiate lower drug prices which would have a profound effect on the cost of Medicare, or by cutting fraud or waste or abuse in military contracting. The budget before the Congress tonight proposes cutting $11.9 billion from the student loan programs. Your vote and your voice can and will make a difference. But one thing I hope you never forget is how much power you have even right now. And now I'm speaking in particular to the students. Our country has always looked to young people for its inspiration and guidance. I didn't know this until just a few years ago. Thomas Jefferson was 32 years old when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. It was a 26-year-old Martin Luther King who led the bus boycott in Montgomery. More recently, Steve Jobs started Apple, Bill Gates started Microsoft, and Michael Dell started Dell Computers, all at the age of 21. That is not to say you have to start a revolution or found Microsoft or make $1 billion to make a difference. You don't. Oftentimes it's the collective accumulation of millions of smaller acts coming together that can make the biggest difference in a community or in our country. And that is well within your power. I should note something else that's in your power. In the elections to be held this November, control of the House of Representatives may actually be decided here in the state of Iowa. You have two races in the 1st and 3rd congressional districts that are very competitive, and the entire nation will be watching. And your involvement could make the difference in those two races and ultimately who it is that controls the House of Representatives. Trust me, I know close races. First time I was elected in South Dakota, it was by 14 votes, which we say in our state is 60%, but that's another issue. But after a year and 21 days of recount, I was finally declared the winner with 110. I know the power of one vote. One final piece of advice, if I can share it. Don't ever doubt the distance of your ideas and the remarkable impact you have on others. Let me tell you just a quick story. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Afghanistan. Hamid Karzai had just taken over, and it was a remarkable scene. Driving in from the airport, Kabul, I was amazed at all of the abandoned military weaponry that I saw on the sides of the roads, going all the way back to the Russian occupation. We finally got to this gray, bombed-out palace. Windows broken, doors smashed. But that's where the president was. We walked into a lobby about the size of this room, and it was almost like a scene out of Star Wars. People in every conceivable kind of dress, Western business suits, Afghan traditional garb. Some who had walked for days to have their few moments with the new president. But everyone was wearing heavy coats. It was winter, and the palace had no power, no lights. We walked into the president's room. He too had a coat and asked us to keep ours on. He said, "Senator Daschle, I've only been in power a few days, and you know that one of the first questions I asked was how much did we have in our federal treasury? And I was told we had the equivalent of about $2 million. But then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "We have something far more important than energy. For the first time, we have hope." And he said, "I'll tell you something. We want to be like you." I thought, what a compliment. But then I thought, what an awesome responsibility. If other countries want to be like us, can we set a standard to give them the inspiration to be all that they can be, going all the way back to our founding fathers? But he wasn't talking about some abstract version of our founding fathers. He was talking about the America he saw today. You are the ones who are going to ensure that nations around the world continue to see us as a beacon of hope. You are the ones who will make it burn even brighter. You are the ones who will conquer freedom anew in so many ways over the course of your lifetimes. You know, the people that my friend described about his friend who went back to Czechoslovakia didn't save those flags for 45 years because they admired our Constitution, although they may have. They didn't save those flags because we had the most powerful military in the world, even though we did. They didn't save those flags because we had the strongest economy the world has ever known, even though we did. They saved those flags because they remembered the courage, the selflessness of the Bob Doles and my father and all of those who went to defend a people they didn't even know. America's greatness may be inherited, but it is not guaranteed. It is bolstered and defended by each successive generation. And the challenges we face tonight are very great, but so are our abilities. And some look at economic indicators to figure out how America is doing. I prefer to look at the American people. And tonight, once again, I never fail to be heartened by what I see. Thank you all very, very much for giving me the chance to do this tonight. Thank you. John and John say that I'm free to take questions, and I'd be delighted to do so. I think there are microphones, so I assume that because this is being videotaped, I think they want you to go to the microphone to be able to take the question. Yes.
Thank you, Senator, for coming. I just have two really quick questions. I remember it was November 21, 2003, and the Senate was debating the energy bill, which you touched on quite a bit, and I appreciate that. It was voting on cloture, on the filibuster on that. And you and Senator Harkin and several other Democrats did vote for cloture. And I remember listening to Senator Grassley pleading to vote for cloture. And I was just curious if you could touch on the role that you have as the role you had as a leader and as your role as a senator representing like South Dakota, and the two different hats that you would wear in terms of that. And also, another quick question I have is a lot of people are talking about faith in American politics, and one of the biggest constituencies growing right now in the Democratic Party is people that consider themselves secular. And could you just comment on what Democrats need to do in terms of being able to talk about faith and also continue to keep their base together? Thank you so much for coming.
Good questions. Let me talk about the first one. The energy bill was a very, very complicated and controversial piece of legislation for several reasons. One in particular, and that was that there were some members of the House of Representatives who had included in the legislation a bailout for the producers of methyl tertiary butyl ether, which is a very toxic chemical that is added to gasoline. And they wanted to give them complete liability freedom, just complete independence from any requirement for liability for all the toxic dumps that had been created as a result of the use of methanol around the world, around the country. And there were a lot of people in our caucus in particular that were deeply opposed to that, not to mention drilling in ANWR, which was another concern at the time. But Tom Harkin and I and a few people in the Midwest felt that it was important to keep the process going, even though we had very severe differences of opinion with some of the provisions of the bill, in the hope that we could work them out. Ultimately, unfortunately, we were unable to work them out before the end of the session. But it does bring an interesting dilemma sometimes, because you always have to make an assessment. What's in the best interests of my people, my state, and my country? And making that judgment on a daily basis, I think, is one of the greatest challenges any legislator has. I think you have to be true to yourself. I think you have to be able to leave with your head held high and be able to defend any position you take regardless of circumstances. And I feel I can say that tonight. But that is a tough challenge. I think that, and the second question you asked was, the secular, yes. In our society, I think faith must play a very important role in our values judgment and the decisions that we as a country must make. I think we have to be very concerned, however, about any faith that claims to have the sole truth, the only truth. I worry about what we see right now with fundamentalist factions in the Islamic countries, because they claim the only truth, the sole truth, not allowing for secular divisions and not allowing the empathy and the tolerance. I tell people that for our democracy to survive, four things have to occur. First, we have to retain the tolerance that was so much a part of our society, even though, as imperfect as it is, we have so far to go with regard to creating the kind of tolerant society our founding fathers first dreamed of. But tolerance is essential. The second is respect for the rule of law. And frankly, I'm very concerned about the erosion of the respect for rule of law tonight as I look at what is happening in some cases in Washington. Third, you need leadership. Without it, you have anarchy. And fourth, and perhaps most importantly, you need participation. But tolerance is essential. I am a Democrat because I believe so deeply in social justice. And I believe that so much of my social justice was acquired, my admiration and appreciation for social justice was acquired as I grew up in a parochial school. And I'm proud of my parochial teachings and the values I acquired in my school. but I certainly don't believe that I have all the answers when it comes to my faith. Yes.
Yes, I have a two-part question. Two of the biggest issues, I think, are health care and the energy policy of this administration. It seems as though since Jimmy Carter, conservation has become a word that we need to be ashamed of. So I have that as my number one question. But my second question is, we're spending $515 billion right now on Medicare and Medicaid. The costs of Medicare and Medicaid are increasing at about 15% per year. And I'm one of the baby boomers who will add to the Medicare rolls in about 15 years. And we will basically double the number of people on Medicare. Do you think, looking at regions of the country where healthcare is practiced in different ways, in Miami, Florida, for example, if you look at the Medicare payments per beneficiary, you can see that the Medicare payments per person, that's per patient, are 3 times what they are in Iowa and in South Dakota. Do you think that healthcare, as well as our energy policy, should emphasize cost effectiveness and conservation?
Absolutely. I would say efficiency may be a more timely word today, because I think that we aren't as efficient as we can be on either front. We waste way too much money in both healthcare and in energy. I think it's abhorrent. It's just amazing to me that we have not passed new legislation for fuel efficiency standards for automobiles since 1983. We ought to be ashamed of that. We can do a lot better, and other companies have done a lot better, and they're benefiting in the marketplace today as a result. I don't know how many Priuses I've driven in the last 6 months, but it's amazing to me that when I see that gauge and it says I'm getting 48 or 50 miles to the gallon, that every car in this country couldn't get that if we didn't have the technology required before it's sold. So I think we can do a lot with regard to efficiency, in addition to the other things that I talked about tonight. With regard to health care, I don't know how any American can accept the fact that we pay $5,500 for every man, woman, and child in the country and we're come out 37th in performance. We ought not stand for that. We have to have a change in our healthcare system. And I think until we change our entire system, it's going to be impossible to change Medicare and Medicaid to the degree we have to bring about the changes necessary to do it right. You talk about reimbursement, and those are changes that we can do independent of health care reform. But the time has come in this country to pass meaningful health care reform. But unfortunately, about a week ago, I was talking to some of the preeminent experts at Harvard about health insurance, and they made a surprising assertion. Not surprising to me because I've heard it in other contexts, but for these two extraordinary experts to say, you know, Senator Daschle, you're never going to get health care reform passed until you get campaign reform passed. And I think that is exactly right. We need so badly to change our campaign laws in this country. And frankly, I've come to the conclusion that it's going to take a constitutional amendment. And it's with some trepidation that I talk about changing our United States Constitution. But that's how badly I think we've got to change the laws to take the special interests out and address these problems once and for all in a meaningful way. Yes.
Good evening, Senator. I'm the historian and the national co-chair, or the international co-chair for the National State Teachers of the Year. And as a result of that, I have been all over the world teaching and traveling. And you mentioned the Ukraine tonight. I was in the Ukraine in 2003 teaching, and I was in a room about half the size of this in a museum. And on the wall in that museum, the only thing on the walls in that museum were pictures of 9/11 in this small, out-of-the-way Ukrainian city. And as an American, that was a shock to me to go there and to see that fantastic, almost surrounding in a blanket of care and concern that the Ukrainians had for the Americans after 9/11. And I was there in 2003 when George Bush went into Iraq. And the Ukrainians absolutely did not understand why we were doing that. And it was an awful position from my point of view to be there to try to represent something that I couldn't explain myself. And what I'm asking is, how do we go about getting the respect that we had before 90 or after the 9/11 and before Iraq back to our country?
Well, I think we've got to remember that in spite of our power, in spite of our abilities to do almost anything we want economically or militarily, that this administration has forgotten the word humility in terms of creating the kind of dialogue and the kind of relationship that we need in the international community. Humility. That doesn't mean we have to bend to the wishes of others, but I don't think we're very good listeners. I don't think we're very good at reaching out and making people feel as if their voices can be heard even if we differ. And until that happens, until we can truly make people believe that we're going to listen, I don't think we're going to change our image.
Good evening, Senator. I have a question about the midterms, and it seems to me, I'm excited about the midterms coming up, but I'm concerned that when I watch politicians in Washington right now, in the Democratic Party, that we seem to be always being negative, good at pointing out what's wrong with the system, but we seem almost devoid of any new ideas, new proposals that we can all get behind. And what I'm wondering is, given the topic that you have tonight, how we can pull our act together to get a majority back.
Well, that's a very good question, and I think the Democratic Party owes it to the American people to speak as loudly and as clearly about what it is we would do were we to govern again, whether it's in Congress or in the White House. It's not enough to point out the failures of this administration or this Republican Congress. I think we have to specify and be as clear as we can be with regard to the issues that we would make priorities. I personally hope that we would say health care would be one of the priorities that we would address in a comprehensive way. I'd like to say we would be energy independent if Democrats were to control government once again. I'd like to say that we would bring back the perception and our stature around the world. Those are some of the issues that I think Democrats feel strongly about. Now, it's very hard for Democrats today in the minority to get the attention of the news media and to be able to say with the kind of clarity that the president can when he steps into the Rose Garden, this is what we want to do. But I think we have to keep trying. And the more we can do it in a unified way, the louder and more amplified that voice is going to be. Yes?
However, one of the criticisms of the earliest primaries and caucuses is they're held in states such as Iowa and New Hampshire, which are not as representative of the general U.S. population. So I was wondering what you think about moving the caucuses to states like South Carolina or Michigan, which are more representative of the U.S. and in particular the Democratic base.
Well, I don't think that we have to change the order, but I do believe that the point is well taken, that moving up some of the other primaries or caucuses to ensure that there is, in the early stages, in the first few weeks of the campaign cycle, that there be an opportunity for minorities and other regions of the country to be heard and to be engaged in this early selection process makes sense. But that doesn't mean you have to change the Iowa caucuses or the New Hampshire primary. I think you can do it in concert with what we already have. Just move them up. And I would hope we would do that. The one thing that I think an Iowa or a New Hampshire does that we have to be aware of is that in smaller rural states, people with little money, fewer resources, still have an opportunity to compete because it's a retail competition. You don't have to worry about how much television time necessarily. You can still make an impact, as President Carter demonstrated in 1976. So that access in a retail setting, in living rooms, in small halls, makes a big difference as we choose our president, and I hope we keep doing that. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Scott Williams. I'm a graduate student in engineering here at Iowa State. First and foremost, I want to tell you thank you very much for coming and talking with us here at Ames and Iowa State this evening. You're an excellent and inspiring speaker.
Thank you.
As a graduate student, education is a very important issue to me. And the comment that you made earlier is the one that I wanted to focus on. The fact that education scales with a factor of income. It's a very interesting point. And on a larger scale, I think that it would be it wouldn't take me very long to find evidence that lots of other yardsticks for measuring the quality of life in the United States scale as a function of income. For instance, healthcare. The general health of a citizen scales as a function of income as well. And I'm curious to know your opinion about the current tax system or the appropriate method for addressing the problem of income and its distribution in this country, whether or not our current tax system has the appropriate infrastructure or if something else is necessary in order to address income and its wide-reaching implications in education, healthcare, etc.
Well, I think that our problems involving economic stratification in this country are ones we all ought to be concerned about. I'm told, and I haven't seen any recent statistics to verify this, but I'm told that the spread between the richest and the poorest is the greatest that it's been since we've started keeping records of that kind. And for that to happen in this day and age, this year being 2006, is just outrageous. It's unacceptable. But your question points out why it's happening. It's happening in part because access to higher education is harder rather than easier today for people of lower income. Access to health care, access to a good job. And so all the opportunities become more encumbered for those at lower incomes. And I think we've got to address that if we're truly the egalitarian society that we claim to be. We are a land of opportunity, but it's getting harder and harder for those at the bottom rungs of the economic scale to avail themselves of the opportunities that I had. And that's wrong. We ought to ensure universal access to higher education. I'd like to see every single young child who is in that age category between 2 and 5 years old have the kind of health care and daycare that will give them the chance to come to school ready to learn. Too many of our children don't have the ability to come to school ready to learn because they haven't been given the opportunity. And that is a function of income more than anything else. So we've got to address that, or we're going to pay a price. What I said probably ad nauseum tonight, that we're all in this together, is so true. You can't ignore the fact that those people are struggling. We're going to be affected by it. And we're affected by it tonight in ways that we can't even count. So your question is right on the mark.
Senator Daschle, you've talked at some length tonight about social justice, and a statistic that came to mind as the gentleman before me was speaking was Feed the Children Canada has reported that the richest 368 people in the world have a net worth equal to the annual income of the poorest 2.5 billion people in this world. And I know some Democratic people, Dick Gephardt, come to mind, have talked about an international minimum wage of some variety. And I was wondering if you had anything to say about that, and just a general comment concerning some of the, I would say, compassionate right in this country that health care for everyone, universal health care, is pro-life. That's
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think you're absolutely right. There are people that you can't imagine the problems that maybe even in this room. People, I used to hold these sessions where I would talk like this, and then I would just stand in front of the room and let people come up for as long as anybody wanted to talk. And the horror stories people would share about their health conditions and their economic conditions as a result of their health conditions are absolutely right. But your point about an international minimum wage, I'd like to see an international living wage. We've got to see the rest of the world addressed in a more constructive and meaningful way. Now, we've got to help these countries help themselves, and we can't just demand it of them without working and recognizing that we're all in this together internationally, just as we are domestically. But I think at some point, if we're truly going to be globalized, and if this is a flattened world, then we have an equal responsibility to help those abroad as they begin to grapple with the many social challenges they too must face. Yes?
Senator Daschle, when you were in the Senate, were you made aware of this administration's warrantless wiretapping program? And if so, why didn't you question its legality?
We were made aware of certain activities that unfortunately are classified and I can't describe, but I will tell you what I have told countless members of the media. There were many omissions, and we weren't prepared, we weren't provided an opportunity to fully appreciate what it was we were being told, or to discuss the matter in a way that would allow us then to review the information we were provided in a way that would allow that information then to be considered, debated, and ultimately responded to in a more meaningful way. I will say this, right after the calamity of 9/11, we had to pass a resolution in the Senate to authorize the President additional authority to take certain actions to apprehend terrorists abroad. They specifically asked for authority to do similar kinds of things within the United States, and we denied that. They asked for language that would specify that authority in the resolution, and it was denied. That's why I find it all the more troubling that they're using that resolution now as the source of their authority to do the kinds of things that have been reported. So, unfortunately, we were not provided the kind of scope of briefing and activities about the activities that would have given us a better understanding because of their omissions. But we clearly know they weren't provided with the authority to do what they're doing as they now cite that authority in story after story that I read. Yes.
Senator, let me first of all say my parents are Clarence and Phyllis Fegan, who farmed at the Aerostatus Center.
Absolutely, I know them.
And I'm the product of 12 years of presentation and education myself. The question I've got for you tonight is, you, like Bob Dole, know where the bodies are buried in Washington. You're the former Senate Majority Leader. The question I've got for you tonight is, your message is of change. Is it a message of 10 degrees change, 90 degrees change, or 180? And I guess the text of your message said to me, if we make small changes as Democrats, we can change this country. Is that the message you're delivering tonight, or is your message that we need to turn 180 degrees? And if we need to turn 180 degrees, you have activist Democrats here tonight. Tell us what you're asking us to do to make that change in this country.
Well, I'm asking for big change. If you took from my message tonight that I was asking for very small change, I didn't get through to you, and I'd love to talk to you a lot longer after the program, because I believe we need big change. We need big change in energy policy, big change in healthcare policy, big change in the way we have formulated our fiscal policy, big change in the perception towards the United States around the world, big change in education policy. We need dramatically big change, and I believe that the only way it's going to happen is through the active engagement of people who care about the direction this country is taking. And I mean active engagement. I mean working on campaigns and making a big difference in the 2 congressional elections that can make a huge difference in control of the House right here in Iowa. It means engaging and speaking out on these issues from this very day forward until we elect a new president in 2008.
Thank you, Senator.
And that's a perfect lead into my question. I'm Susan Radke, and I'm running in District 10 against Jim Kurtenbach. And I believe strongly that we need a change from the bottom up. And I wondered who you were thinking should be on our Democratic presidential ticket.
Well, this is the beauty of our party is that we have a lot of good people, and I think it's way too early. I think that we've got to win. I'd like to win the Senate and the House in 2006 and put all of our energy into making sure that in those competitive races that we could really win back those two houses. And I believe we can. I think it's not something that's going to be easy. It's not a given, but it's certainly within the realm of possibilities. And if we focus on that first, we're going to be in a lot better position to pick our best candidate in 2008.
And I think with your leadership and inspiration, that will happen.
Thank you.
Before we follow up on that, it also is about running for president. You mentioned how important the Iowa caucuses were. But one thing we don't have any control over is who shows up. And I'm quite concerned about the fact that perhaps we're not being offered, the country is not being offered the best candidates. One of the ways I think about this is that I asked one of the staff members last time, why are you not raising money in Iowa when you have these events? He said, Iowa is a state where we spend money, not raise it. You have to have money, some money, to come to Iowa. You have to be bankrolled by some people. It does seem that part of the problem is how are we going to get the right people to even run in the first place?
Well, that's I think the most important thing. If you've got some people in mind, start encouraging them, because nothing works better than to get the encouragement and to urge that involvement. And you're right. I mean, we have a lot of people, but that doesn't mean they're all going to run, and maybe the best ones won't run. I think it's important you encourage the ones that you'd like to see run.
We don't know who they are.
Well, you will by then. Right. No, that's a good point.
I would like to thank Senator Daschle for speaking tonight and invite all of you to participate in the book signing, or if you have any questions you'd like to address to him, feel free to join us.
Thank you all very much.